So here is the second part, and I'm gonna just get the automatic reader going on it. And here we go. Edit, and we're gonna do a little speech right here and start speaking. Here we go. The second part.
Three generations of the Wilson and Griffith families sat for this family portrait. He had enrolled at Norwich University, which had entrance requirements far easier than MIT's, called The Hill, Norwich, in Northfield, Vermont, is a military college with discipline as strict as at West Point. In the midsummer of 1914, Europe was on the verge of war, and there was a possibility, albeit slight, that the United States might be drawn into it. In August, just prior to the start of his first year at Norwich, Bill went to visit his father. It was the first time he had seen Gilman since the divorce 8 years previous. Bill made the long journey to British Columbia on a transcontinental train that he boarded in Montreal. His letters home, written to his grandmother Wilson, describe the journey west in striking detail. I woke up with a ringing in my ears and feeling a peculiar exhilaration. This was my first view of the Rockies. The mountains rise straight up and are clothed about the bases with scrub evergreens, excepting when great slides have torn paths down the sides. The mountains are formed of many colored shells lying in strata, sometimes tilted, sometimes horizontal. Everything is jagged and angular, showing marks of sudden and violent changes, a great contrast to the smooth, gentle curves of our mountains. Great number of streams rush down the sides fed from the perpetual snows above the timberline. Every high valley above the snow line has its glacier. The ice is a beautiful deep blue covered here and there with great white patches of newly fallen snow. The sky is cloudless and almost matches the ice in color. We pass through miles of such scenery as this. On one side of the road the peaks rise up like a wall, so straight and abrupt that it seems that their snows would slide off onto the train. To preclude any possibility of this, miles and miles of snow sheds have been built. On the other side, one looks down into the river gorge, sometimes deep enough to be called a canyon. There is always the deep, narrow, swift-flowing river with numerous falls and splendid rapids. Forever tearing at its banks, it undermines great rocks and cedars, which falling in are swept away like toothpicks on the dark flood, already showing the powers of observation that would later serve him so well on Wall Street. Bill remarked on the oil field discoveries and natural gas developments in Alberta. He noted that in Medicine Hat, Alberta, the streetlights operated on natural gas that was never turned off, since the gas flowed as strongly as the day it was found 22 years before. Bill's letters were written on his father's office stationery from Marblehead, British Columbia, a small community high in the Canadian Rockies. The letterhead listed G.B. Wilson as manager of the Marblehead Quarries of Canadian Marble Works Limited, quarry owners and manufacturers of Kootenay marbles. Its main offices were in Nelson, British Columbia. For all Bill's detailed descriptions of his surroundings, there was nothing in his letters about his reunion with his father. Father and son apparently
I
got
notice
along
when I
well,
don't write
although
my
Gilman
two-minute
seems
letters
to
every
have
day,
made
and
little
I
effort
get
to keep in touch with his children. A
sense
month
of
later, Bill was an
security,
entering freshman at Norwich,
everything being
which at that time
predictable.
had a total enrollment of
It's hard
145.
to
Bill
feel
was miserable during his first semester
executed.
there. Again, I felt I was nobody. I couldn't even begin to compete in athletics, in music, or even for popularity with the people around me. I so keenly remember when the rush for the fraternities was on, and I didn't get a bit to a single one. I tried out for baseball and football and wasn't good enough for either first team. I remember how there was a fellow who played the violin so much better than I that I could not even get into the dance orchestra. I remember how I produced an old cello that I had and somehow scraped up a part in the glee club with that. But I was very second rate. Some of my studies I handled very well. Others I began to fail in. However, a letter to his mother written shortly after he arrived paints a very different picture. There are 4 fraternities here. Have been to all several times to dinner, and have had bids to join 3, which is quite an honor for a rook. However, I figured that if one is going to join a frat, it might be good to take a year to size up the bunches who belong some months later. He brought up the fraternity matter again. Can't seem to get away from being popular. Have had second invitations to all the frats, but think it policy to stall. Just the minute you join a frat, you join more or less of a clique, in spite of all that's done to prevent it. The frats can pull strings in the military business, and by keeping out of them, I think one will stand more on his own merits. As it is now, I am popular with men of the strongest frats here. If I join one, I lose my influence with all the rest. So me for the commons. 1. During that first semester, Bill received 94 in
I
chemistry,
had a
86 in
handheld
French,
shaver
75 in drawing, 68 in
to
English,
shave
61 in
here.
trigonometry, and
It had a
53 in
sticker on the top
algebra.
that said
He had
"One
an
size
outstanding
fits
rating of
all."
98 in military duty and 100 in deportment. His
Could be.
final average of
It had two of
86
them.
gave him a
The
standing
other
of
one is
5th in
burned
his
out on me,
class. If he
but I
was not
cannot
leading the
find
pack,
this one.
he was certainly holding his own. From a letter to
Can
his
you
mother,
ask around
written
and
in
see if anybody
February,
has
I'm
borrowed
glad to
it
know
or
that you are
used in
pleased
someone
with at
else's
least a
room
part
and
of my
forgotten
mark.
about it?
The week preceding
Really like it
midyears,
back.
I was laid up with a
Rick is
touch
getting
of the grip
bushy. I
and
think I
thus
should
missed the general review which is held at the time. So my exams were not what they should have been. Algebra was the first exam and I got out of bed to take it. For the rest of them I had a whole day preparation. My exams fortunately coming one every other day. I took a makeup exam Saturday and passed with 65%. Could I have done that in the first place? I should have ranked third or fourth in the class. At any rate, I do not compare unfavorably with the others. I am confident of ranking in second place next semester as I expect to get over 90% in 4 subjects. But it did not turn out that way. On a morning early in his second semester, he fell on his way to class and injured his elbow. He insisted on going to Boston to be treated by his mother, who by now was a practicing osteopath. He had no desire to return to school. How terribly reluctant I was to face that discipline, and that idea of being no good and second rate. As I got on the train going from Boston back to Northfield, I began to have terrible sensations in the solar plexus. I felt like the world was coming to an end, short of breath, having heart palpitations. I was in stark panic that I had heart trouble and was going to die. Back at school, as soon as I would attempt a few simple exercises, this terrible palpitation would set in, and I would collapse. Following these attacks, Bill would be taken to the college infirmary, but no physical cause could be found for his troubles. This happened again and again, until, at the end of a couple of weeks, I was sent to my grandfather in East Dorset, which was just exactly where I wanted to go. He was overcome by inertia, unable to do anything. I used to go into fits of palpitations and cry to see the doctor. He said the doctor gave him a bromide and tried to persuade him that there was nothing wrong with his heart. Bill stayed with his elderly grandparents that spring and summer, and gradually recovered enough to consider returning to Norwich for the fall semester. An April letter to his mother shows how preoccupied he was with his health problems. Up to the time Dr. Grinnell made his second visit, I had been miserable, some days eating nothing and the most a few slices of soft toast, terribly sour stomach, consequent heartburn and palpitation. This last, of course, scares me to death. Makes me mad to think I am scared, but I am just the same. Dr. Grinnell came about 6 p.m. I was feeling awfully. He applied a stethoscope and said at once that I had the best valve action he had seen for some time. Desired me to listen. I did so. Sounded just the same as it did last time. I registered immediate relief. He said that the large intestine was rather inactive, causing sour stomach and gas. Gave me a mild physic to take after eating. Did not seem to think my stomach was out of order. Grandpa and Grandma think so. Hence they pursued him until he said, I don't think diet has anything to do with this case. He saw that he said the wrong thing, so he afterward qualified the statement by saying, Of course, he mustn't eat too much. A very definite statement. You see, Bill's heart problems were clearly temporary. He soon recovered and had no difficulty either in passing the Army's physical examination in 1917 or in performing his military duties. Another letter, also written that spring, indicates that Bill was feeling better and had his mind on other things. He wanted an automobile. I looked over the catalogue you sent with some interest and threw it aside. Grandpa picked it up and began to look it over. Pretty soon he began to talk about the machine some. Grandma remarked that it must be hard to learn to run a machine in view of this fact, that Jim Beebe wouldn't learn to run his. Grandpa at once waxed enthusiastic and said he guessed there wasn't much to it. Said he bet he could learn in short order. Heard no more about autos for a couple days. One morning he came in from the garden and said, "Better send and get one of those, hadn't we? Seems as if we might get the agency perhaps. Guess I could sell those things. Never saw anything I couldn't sell yet." Naturally I was interested. We got the terms for agents through Will Griffith, who has been offered the agency, and Grandpa had me go to Manchester and talk up the machine. I went, and banking on your consent have practically disposed of one to the Bamfords. As to the financial risk, there is none, I think. This is also Grandpa's opinion for the selling of one machine. Excludes the risk element, and Grandpa has a sneaking notion that he wants one anyway. We figure that there is about $85 profit on a machine. Now to come to my present condition. I'm glad to say that sinking spells and dizziness have totally disappeared. I have palpitation on a strenuous exertion. I'm yet nervous. I'm convinced that will disappear as soon as I convince myself that nothing ails my heart. I have no stomach symptoms. I'm able to eat everything. I'm physically myself as regards weight and strength. Obviously, a diversion of the mind will now effect a cure. I know of no subject upon which I can discourse with greater intelligence or enthusiasm than automobiles. Consider the body risks. There are chances to be taken. Accidents occur daily. I should say the risks encountered in autos are considerably less than those Grandpa has taken taming kicking horses, or that tunnel workers have of a scale dropping on their head, or that you took as a child in running around on the edge of a flume, or on narrow beams in the top of a bun, or that I have taken every day at school, with bucking horses. Consider the number of accidents, also the number of autos. Each Ford runs off 1,800 of them a day. If this amounts to a nervous strain to which I should be subjected in driving, perhaps you are the better judge. Certainly not more than steering a horse over a 3-foot hurdle. Certainly no more demand upon concentrative faculties than as much violin practice. Certainly a more healthful occupation. I have heard you say that no more exhilarating and yet mild form of exercise existed than motoring. Now as to the danger which would be peculiar to me. Perhaps at this moment I am not fit to operate a machine because I am too nervous. But I'm not going to be this way all summer. At the present rate of improvement, shall be restored in another month. Normally, you know, I am about as excitable as a mud turtle. It cuts me to think you have not enough confidence in my judgment to allow me to do what Jamie Beebe, Clifford Copping, Francis Money, David Cochrane, Lyman Burnham are allowed to do without the parents entertaining grave fears as to their safety. Rogers Burnham has driven since he was 14. I should hate to think my judgment at present is not the equal of his at that time. Again, autos have come to stay. They will soon be as common as horses. You consider yourself competent to drive a machine with safety. You even would like to have ridden a motorcycle. You certainly could do both. But I should be fearful of your trying a motorcycle as you would that I attempt the auto. Love from Will. In a later letter to his mother, there is no reference to illness or doctors. He had been hired to play the fiddle for 10 dances, for which he was to receive $5 per dance. His confidence in his own playing had clearly risen. As he told his mother, "I do think that I can put myself through school with it. Have played enough for money now so that the thing has lost its glamour. And it really seems like work. have improved a lot since you were here. During the summer of 1915, Bill had a job peddling burners for kerosene lamps in nearby villages. That summer, Lois had opened a small tea arbor at the north end of Emerald Lake. Bill found a number of reasons to turn up at the tea arbor during the day. He didn't sell many burners and I didn't sell much tea, but we had wonderful visits, Lois said. Often I would give him a treat of wild strawberries or fried picked on the hill mushrooms on toast. By late summer, their courtship had become serious, but Bill had competition. Several years earlier, Lois had met a young Canadian named Norman Schneider at a young people's church convention. Norman's family owned a meat packing firm in Kitchener, Ontario. Lois and Norman had dated. He was a good person, nice looking and intelligent. She had enjoyed being with him. Now, he came to the lake for a week's visit, and just before he left to return to Canada, he asked Lois to marry him. Lois, who had longed to be with Bill every minute she was with Norman, had her answer. Just as Norman stepped on the train for Montreal, Bill jumped off. She wrote, "We walked back to the lake together, but somehow our fingers often seemed to brush against each other." That same evening, they told each other of their love and became engaged. When asked many years later whether she had any regrets, Lois replied, "Never, never, never, never. It never occurred to me. I never dreamt about anybody but Bill Wilson." At first, Bill and Lois kept their betrothal a secret from everybody except Mark Whalen, in whom Bill did confide. Mark was a sort of uncle or father to Bill. They had worked together on summer jobs and helped string the first telephone lines into East Dorset. They also hunted and fished together, and they shared an interest in Vermont history. Later, they would drink together, although Mark's drinking never progressed into alcoholism. During the fall of 1915, Bill made an effort to compensate for past failures at school. His course of study was electrical engineering, which he chose because of his interest in science. Some of his old drive had finally returned, and he began to become popular on campus. Several of his classmates found themselves involved in a hazing incident. Because no one would name names, the whole class was suspended for a full term. The hazing scandal and the suspension happened to coincide in time with the Mexican border troubles. The following year, U.S. troops under General Pershing were sent into Mexico in a vain attempt to capture Pancho Villa. Because the Norwich cadets were part of the Vermont National Guard, they were mobilized, although they never were sent to the border. The mobilization was fortuitous for Bill, because it meant that he was reinstated at Norwich. He continued to be driven by a need to stand out, to do something unique. He found such an opportunity, he believed, in a calculus course. "I was failing miserably in calculus," Bill recalled. He had had difficulty memorizing formulas in algebra, and he was encountering similar problems in calculus. "I realized that I was going to be an absolutely flat failure in calculus. In fact, the professor promised me that I would get 0. Then Bill discovered that his professor had certain shortcomings in his own understanding of the subject. He was a catalogue of formulas. He could apply the formulas. He was glib. But deep down, he didn't know how the thing worked, Bill said, and I made up my mind I would learn. Bill, stretched out at a picnic with Mark Whalen, center foreground, in a pose many remember as characteristic. At the library, he studied the history of mathematics and the evolution of calculus. Finally, he grasped the concept sufficiently to discuss it. He had developed considerable talents in argument. "I got the professor over a barrel, and I made a fool out of him before his class," Bill said. "He did give me 0. But I had won one battle. In other words, I was the only one on the school grounds. The number one man again. The only one who deeply understood the underlying principles of calculus." The incident did nothing to help him academically, but it did make him the center of attention. It was a rerun of the Boomerang Project. His drive for prestige was reasserting itself. making him a sort of hero to his classmates. But a brash upstart in the eyes of his calculus professor, Bill was an unusually gifted young man. Although he was often hypercritical of himself, he possessed a native talent for leadership, which was finally recognized in the military program at Norwich. I had been made a corporal or a sergeant in the corps, Bill said, and then it was discovered that I had talent for instructing people. Curiously enough, though awkward myself, I had talent for drilling people. I had a voice and I had a manner that would compel a willing obedience. And so much so that the attention of the commandant was drawn to it. This talent for leadership would serve him well on active duty in the army, and, he assumed, it would serve him equally well when, upon leaving military service, he would find himself at the head of vast enterprises, which he would manage with utmost assurance. Bill had mixed feelings about military service. It was honor, glory, and duty, but it was also danger and death. Growing up in East Dorset, Bill had spent countless hours target shooting with old Bill Landon, Civil War veteran and great character who lived next door. Grandfather Griffith never talked about the Civil War, but old Bill Landon would spin me yarns by the hour. He had been sergeant on Sheridan's staff, and he used to tell me how, on a charge, a Minié ball had struck his musket butt, and it passed through and stuck in his skull just over the eye, how he plucked it out and continued his charge, and old Bill had a drooping eye, a scar, and poor sight to prove all this. Landon, reliving the glories of the Civil War, also spoke with great scorn of those who had managed to avoid active service. One of the worst forms of opprobrium that could be cast on anybody when I was a kid was to be called a slacker. Bill remembered those who failed to go to the Civil War, evaded service, or got some sort of an easy job got a stigma that they carried all their lives. Old Landon had told Bill about a wealthy and respected East Dorset citizen who carried this stigma, all during the Civil War. He was ill and used to toddle down to the village with a long shawl over his shoulders, very much stooped, with a bottle of smelling salts. And all during that period, no one would speak to him, said Landon. As a young officer, Bill anticipated honor and glory, feared danger, and had his first drink. But in the cemetery south of East Dorset is a marker for Waldo Barrows, Bill's great-uncle, killed in the 1864 Battle of the Wilderness, and the Gettysburg battlefield, which Bill had visited with his grandfather, also had a cemetery. Neurotic that I was ambivalent, he said. The great upwellings of patriotism would overtake me one day, and the next day, I would just be funked and scared to death. And I think that the thing that scared me most was that I might never live my life out with Lois, with whom I was in love. The tradition of military service, however, was deeply embedded in Bill. When America entered World War I in 1917, he was called up by the military and never graduated from Norwich. When he was called, he chose to serve in the Coast Artillery. The decision later caused him guilt, because it was considered one of the safer branches of military service. From Norwich, Bill was sent to the new officers' training camp at Plattsburgh, New York. Here, he discovered that the Norwich cadets' military training had given them a head start on the others in the camp, and he moved rapidly through the training. His flair for leadership brought him further recognition, and after additional training at Fort Monroe, Virginia, he was commissioned as second lieutenant. It was a heady experience for a 21-year-old who only a few years earlier had been in deepest depression. Then, he was sent to Fort Rodman, just outside New Bedford, Massachusetts. Here was all the tradition of the old army, seasoned regular officers and non-coms, along with the drafted men and volunteers. He remembered how I enjoyed that atmosphere, encouraged as I was by actually being put in command of soldiers. But still there crept into me at times that nagging undertone of fear about going abroad. Lois, accompanied by Bill's grandmother and his sister Dorothy, had visited him at Plattsburgh. She and Bill had now been engaged for almost 2 years, It was clear that they would marry. Lois's parents approved of Bill so completely that she was actually permitted to visit him unchaperoned. Their understanding and their trust in Bill and me were very unusual during that conventional era. Lois wrote. She was 25 years old. Her comment clearly illustrates how young women of her day continued to answer to their parents, even when they were no longer living at home. At this time, Lois had a teaching position in Short Hills, New Jersey, and was living with the aunt who operated the school where she taught. It was at Fort Rodman, New Bedford, that Bill's life took a new course. He learned about liquor. Until that time, he had never had a drink. The Griffiths did not drink, and there was a family memory of what alcohol had done to some of the Wilsons. Bill, who thought it may have been one of the reasons for his parents' divorce, was afraid of liquor. He was critical, specifically of Norwich students who sneaked off to Montpelier to drink beer and consort with loose women. New Bedford was different. Bill would later remember the charged atmosphere of the town in that wartime period. Moments sublime with intervals hilarious. He also remembered the social circles that opened to young officers like him. The society people in town began to invite the young officers to their homes. He recalled, one of the great fortunes, and one of the leading families of New Bedford, was the Grinnell family. They were very rich and very much socialites. I remember so well Emmy and Catherine Grinnell. Emmy's husband had gone off to the wars. Katie had lost hers. And the two of them used to entertain a group of us kids at their house. This was the first time in my life that I had ever been out in society. This was the first time in my life that I had ever seen a butler. And a great rush of fear, ineptitude, and self-consciousness swept over me. In conversation, I could hardly say 2 words. The dinner table was just a terrible trial. At the Grinnells, Bill was offered a Bronx cocktail, usually concocted of gin, dry and sweet vermouth, and orange juice. Despite all the warnings, despite all his training, despite all his fears about drinking, he found himself accepting it. Well, my self-consciousness was such that I simply had to take that drink. He recalled. So I took it, and another one, and then, lo, the miracle, that strange barrier that had existed between me and all men and women seemed to instantly go down. I felt that I belonged where I was, belonged to life. I belonged to the universe. I was a part of things at last. Oh, the magic of those first 3 or 4 drinks. I became the life of the party. I actually could please the guests. I could talk freely, volubly. I could talk well. I became suddenly very attracted to these people and fell into a whole series of dates. But I think, even that first evening, I got thoroughly drunk, and within the next time or two, I passed out completely. But as everybody drank hard, nothing too much was made of that. By his own account, Bill was an excessive drinker from the start. He never went through any moderate stage or any period of social drinking. Bill's inner warning system must have told him his drinking was unusual, because he kept the lid on when Lois came to visit him and was invited to meet his friends. But he did not stop altogether. Without liquor, Bill again felt inferior. It was now early 1918. The United States was fully at war, and Bill could be shipped out at any time. He and Lois had set their wedding day for February 1st. There was a rumor that Bill was to be sent overseas soon, so they decided to push the wedding date up to January 24th and change the invitations to announcements. They chose to go ahead with the big church wedding they had planned, and everyone pitched in to help. It was all done in such a rush that the best man, Lois's brother Rogers, arrived from Camp Devens too late to change his heavy-duty boots and had to stomp down the aisle. Meeting Lois, here in her wedding dress, lifted Bill out of deep depression and into love and renewed hope. In Brooklyn for the wedding, Bill was again conscious of those horribly familiar feelings of inferiority. He even imagined that some of Lois's family and friends were asking, where did Lois get that one? In contradiction, He also remembered that they went out of their way to make him feel comfortable. Lois, on her part, was clearly delighted with her new husband, and with the great welcome that waited for the couple at the furnished apartment Bill had rented for them in New Bedford. Flowers and plants were everywhere, and people dropped in continuously to congratulate us. She recalled Bill was very popular on the post. One aspect of his new social life had been unknown to Lois, but she discovered it while they were in New Bedford. Bill remembered that during this period, he must have passed out at about every third party. At a party one evening, Lois was shocked to hear Bill's army buddies tell how they had dragged him home and put him to bed. Still, she was not terribly perturbed about it, confident that she could persuade him to return to his former abstinence. Living with me would be such an inspiration. I was sure he would not need alcohol. In his recollections of that period, Bill referred frequently to his fear of going to war and his shame about that fear. He even felt that he was letting his Vermont ancestors down. None of those who came across the mountains with rifles and axes would have acted like that. He was sent to Fort Adams near Newport, Rhode Island, to await orders. Finally, the dreaded day arrived. On an August night, just a few hours before he was to ship out for England, he and Lois climbed one of the beautiful Newport cliffs that overlook the sea. Their mutual gloom and depression of a sudden lifted and was replaced by a feeling of patriotism and duty. She and I gazed out over the ocean, wondering. The sun was just setting, and we talked about the future with joy and optimism. There, I felt the first glimmerings of what I was to later understand as a spiritual experience. I shall never forget it. Aboard a British ship Lancashire in the North Atlantic, two significant things happened to Bill. The first was that he met a ship's officer who shared his brandy with Bill. The second was that in a brief encounter with danger, Bill discovered, to his great relief, that he was a man of courage after all. The prospect of this test, which he knew he must sooner or later face, had made him apprehensive, pessimistic, and occasionally sick with self-doubt. The Lancashire was a troop transport. Her decks were packed solid with bunks and, in the middle of the night, sleeping men. Officers were stationed at every hatch on every deck. Bill was on night watch below decks, practically on the keel, where the men would be the last to be rescued in an emergency. The Lancashire was not far from the British coast. Bill was trying to stay awake. Suddenly, there was a huge thud against the hull of the ship. The men were instantly awakened. In the same instant, headed in a panic for the ladder at the base of which Bill was stationed. He pulled out his gun. He had orders to shoot any who tried to climb out without permission, but instead of using the gun, he used his voice. In a few minutes, he found that he was able to calm the men, to reassure them, and to prevent panic without his having any information about what had actually happened. In turn, he was as reassured as they were, because the incident gave proof of the courage that he had so sorely doubted. There had been no real danger. An American depth charge, a so-called Ashkin intended for an enemy ship, had exploded so close to the Lancashire that it had made a shattering noise against the ship's hull. The Lancashire reached England safely. It was shortly after landing there that Bill had another soul-shaking experience. As the experience aboard ship had, it revealed an inner resource that he had never recognized before. An epidemic kept Bill and his regiment detained at a camp near Winchester, depressed, lonely, and apprehensive about what lay ahead. Bill went to visit Winchester Cathedral. Inside the great cathedral, the atmosphere impressed itself so deeply upon him that he was taken by a sort of ecstasy, moved and stirred by a tremendous sense of presence. I have been in many cathedrals since, and have never experienced anything like it, he said. For a brief moment, I had needed and wanted God. There had been a humble willingness to have him with me, and he came. In that moment, Bill knew that everything was all right, as it should be. Benumbed and slightly dazed by his experience, he found his way outside to the churchyard. There, A familiar name carved on an old headstone caught his eye. Thomas T. Dead at age 26. One letter in the last name was different. Still, he could be an ancestor of Bill's good school friend Ebbie T. Bill read with amusement the doggerel that was Thomas's epitaph. This is his memory of how it went. Here lies a Hampshire grenadier slash who caught his death slash drinking cold small beer slash a good soldier is near forgot slash whether he died by musket slash or by pot. 2. Soon afterward, Bill was sent to France, where he at last saw the devastation of war. There, too, he discovered that French wine could produce the same effects as New Bedford liquor, or the brandy he had been introduced to aboard ship. In those closing months of 1918, the war was winding down rapidly, and Bill's artillery unit was settled in a small mountain town, far from the front. The only time he and his fellow artillerymen ran into actual danger was during a practice firing session. Their battalion had placed its guns in positions dug into a bank. They were then supposed to practice firing over a low hilltop and into the countryside beyond. The target was a piece of canvas that had been set up about 9 miles away. Bill was sent to observe the results of the practice. He and his men took up positions in a slit trench about 300 yards from the target, using a periscope to observe the operation from a distance. The number 1 gun fired, and the shell came down practically on the mark. Bill was elated and congratulated the group on their skill, but when the number 4 gun was fired, he suddenly found the earth opening up around him, and tons of dirt blown all over us. Crawling through the dirt, he discovered that the gun had been trained directly on him and his team. It was only a miracle that had saved them. Bill was still in that mountain town on the day the armistice was signed. He was kept in France until spring, and was just developing a taste for French wine when he was finally shipped home, to be separated from the service. Like all returning vets, I ran into a few difficulties, he later recalled. Unlike most of them, I was heading toward a destiny that lay in directions I could not conceivably have anticipated when I stepped off that ship onto the New Jersey shore and into the waiting embrace of my lovely wife. One explanation for the big discrepancy in Bill's memories of that time is, as he himself suggests, that he was struggling to win his mother's approval during this 1914-1915 period, and deliberately lied about the fraternity bids to explain why he did not belong to one. 2. The famous epitaph actually reads, "Here sleeps in peace a Hampshire grenadier, who caught his death by drinking cold small beer, soldiers, be wise from his untimely fall, and when ye are hot, drink strong or none at all / an honest soldier never is forgot, whether he die by musket or by pot." Chapter 3. By the time Bill was mustered out of the army, he had proved himself a leader, and the men of his artillery battery had given him a special token of appreciation. He had an acknowledged ability to get along with others. He had some college education, an aptitude for science and mathematics, and lots of drive. He had, too, the constant support of a loving wife who was confident of his imminent rise to great heights. He also had a sinister new companion, alcohol, not yet apparent as a problem. A drinking pattern was nonetheless already established. When he drank, it was often excessive and sometimes accompanied by odd behavior and blackouts. In May 1919, Bill found himself a free man, intensely ambitious for himself, full of great dreams for the future. He had no specific plans for the present, and like many, another veteran, found it difficult to adjust. For him, it was hard to accept the status of ordinary person again, without the rank and privileges of a commissioned officer. I was much surprised, for example, in the New York subways, when the guards failed to salute me, and when the passengers pushed me around. He said, because he hadn't finished college and wasn't really trained for any trade or profession, he also had trouble finding a job. Lois's father, Dr. Clark Burnham, with whom Lois and Bill were living, was a prominent man in the Brooklyn community. He used his influence to help Bill get a job as a clerk in the insurance department of the New York Central Railroad. In fact, I worked for my brother-in-law, Cy Jones, who was at that time the head clerk. Well, it was a tremendous come down from being an officer and awfully hard to take, especially from a brother-in-law. I worked there some months and turned out to be such a very bad bookkeeper and manager that the New York Central fired me, and that produced a mighty rebellion in me that I would show the town and that I would show these friends of Lois's. In fact, I would show the whole goddamned world. Bill's resentment toward the railroad was so intense that it actually moved him, for a short time, to turn his back on the conservative economic views he had held all his life. At that time, the Socialist Plum Plan for taking over the railroads was in vogue, and very briefly, despite my Vermont training and origin, I turned quite socialist, a reaction, I expect, against the New York Central. Bill then had what he remembered as a period of flunking and slumping in his quest for another job. Finally, I took a job on one of the New York Central piers, driving spikes in planks after the carpenters sawed them off and laid them down. And that got me up very early in the morning way over in Brooklyn. And I had to work up around 72nd Street. And I ran into the New York unions. Well, I wasn't so socialistic now. I objected very much to joining the union. And I was threatened by force. And I left the job rather than join the union. And meanwhile, the drinking had been crawling up. It was partly to give themselves time to think and partly to get Bill away from drinking that Lois persuaded him to take a walking trip with her in Maine. From Boston, they took a boat to Portland, Maine, and walked, carrying packs and army pup tents, from Portland to Rutland, Vermont. A passage from the diary Lois kept on the trip shows how light-hearted and happy they were. Met an ultra-modest red-haired man with his shirt tail hanging out through a hole in the back of his pants, who, most properly, kept his eyes away from the shocking spectacle of a woman in knickers. When asked about the Saco River, he said it was 3 miles down the road, but that he hadn't been that far this summer. We got a fairly early start, but stopped at the first brook. We came to and took our morning baths. Although almost in the center of a place called Ross's Corners, we managed somehow to find a secluded spot. An auto with a horse hitched on behind passed us. Spent the night on the shores of Lake Winnepesaukee. We spied a mink hunting among the rocks and heard a loon calling in the stillness. The northern lights were wonderful on this cold night. We met a joyous farmer with a broad-brimmed calico hat, who sang to his team as he drove them down a hill. He explained to us his singing encouraged the horses not to stumble. After their return to Brooklyn, Lois found work with the Red Cross as an occupational therapist at the Brooklyn Navy Hospital. She had taken a course in occupational therapy while Bill was overseas. Unlike Bill, she never had any trouble holding a job. Bill, too, finally found a job as an investigator in fraud and embezzlement for the United States Fidelity and Guarantee Company. He had also given up his somewhat vague ambition of becoming an engineer and had enrolled instead in night classes at the Brooklyn Law School. It was at his grandfather's insistence that he had abandoned engineering and taken up the study of law. Although he was not sure that he wanted to become a lawyer, he knew that a knowledge of the law would be useful, whatever he finally decided on. While Bill was completing his plans to go to work, he had answered a blind advertisement in the New York Times. To his astonishment, he now received in reply an invitation from Thomas Edison himself. Bill was requested to come to Edison's laboratories in East Orange, New Jersey, for an employment test. A heaven-sent opportunity. Edison was one of Bill's heroes. Though the inventor was very old and his greatest achievements were behind him, he was still active. When Bill arrived at the Edison facilities, he and a number of other applicants were taken into Edison's own laboratory, a long, unpretentious room, and given a written examination. Edison himself was there, seated at a cheap and battered desk in a corner. It was a difficult test, containing 286 questions. Bill remembered. In one question, they would want to know what was the diameter of the moon, and the next question would be what are overtones on a stringed instrument, and the next question was where do they make the most shoes, and the next question would be what kind of wood do they use for oil barrel staves, and it just covered the gamut. The obvious idea was to see whether you'd been observant in your reading and in your observation of things in life in general. Some weeks later, after Bill had already started working for the U.S. Fidelity and Guarantee Company, a New York Times reporter called to interview him as one of the winners in the Edison test. Soon thereafter, Bill received a personal letter from Edison inviting him to join the laboratories as a researcher in the acoustics department. In the test, Bill had demonstrated his considerable knowledge of sound and stringed instruments, a knowledge obviously related to his interests in radio and the violin. Received.
I'm going to stop right here and I'll pick up this spot in the next recording. So there we go. And